Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 104 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. As you may know, I'm a huge fan of the Boston Red Sox. I've been a fan of the team since I was about 5 years old, and I just love cheering them on and watching them play baseball. I also happen to love their rivalry with the New York Yankees. Each season, the Red Sox play the Yankees at least 18 times, and each one of those games feels like my team is playing for a championship. And that's even when the Red Sox are in last place. When the Red Sox play the Yankees, I really need my team to win. Now, if you're not a sports fan, my interest in watching the Red Sox beat the Yankees may not make much sense, and it may even seem a bit weird. But my desire to see my team clobber the Yankees is actually part of a long-standing tradition of cultural rivalry between the regions of New York and New England. A rivalry that long predates the invention of modern-day sports franchises. Since the 17th century, New Englanders and New Yorkers have competed against each other for land, trade, technology, and cultural superiority. The rivalry between these two groups actually dates back to the 16th century, when the people and monarchs of England began to jealously eye Dutch dominance in seafaring and overseas trade. This largely commercial and cultural rivalry followed the English and Dutch to North America, where the English settled in New England and the Dutch settled in an adjacent colony they called New Netherland. Now, the Dutch and English drew imaginary boundary lines between their two settlements, boundary lines that shifted over time as New Englanders took over parts of Connecticut and Long Island. Caught in the middle of these economic, cultural, and land rivals were Native American peoples. Peoples like the Algonquian-Speaking peoples who happened to live along the northeastern coastline between Manhattan and Cape Cod. Now, unlike the English and Dutch, these Algonquian speakers did not see any boundary lines between New England and New Netherland. They view and understood these coastal lands as one continuous region. Today, Andrew Lipman, an assistant professor of history at Barnard College, Columbia University, and the author of The Saltwater Frontier, Indians and the Contest for the American Coast, leads us on an exploration of this coastal region and of the Native American and European peoples who lived there during the 17th century. During our exploration, Drew reveals details about the Native American and European peoples who lived along the New York-New England coastline during the 17th century, northeastern Native American maritime life, and details about the development of the early American whaling industry. But first, did you know that the best way for a podcast to find new listeners is by word-of-mouth recommendations? Telling friends, family, and acquaintances about Ben Franklin's World and your other favorite podcasts is a high compliment, and it also helps your favorite shows grow. I'd like to increase awareness about the history of Ben Franklin's World, so I'd really appreciate it if you would tell at least one person about the podcast and why you enjoy it today. All right, are you ready to travel back in time to the 17th century Northeast? Let's go meet our guest historian.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is an assistant professor of history at Barnard College, Columbia University. His research interests include colonial America, maritime life in the Atlantic world, and Native American history. Today, he joins us to discuss his book, The Saltwater Frontier, Indians and the Contest for the American Coast, winner of the 2016 Bancroft Prize in American History. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Andrew Lipman.
Good morning, Liz.
In Saltwater Frontier, Drew seeks to explore why the first century of colonization was so violent and how some Native American peoples were able to survive that period and remain in their homelands for centuries to come. In an effort to answer these questions, Drew investigates the history of colonization along what is now the New York-New England shoreline, from roughly Manhattan to Cape Cod. Drew, the story of English and Dutch colonization in New England and New Netherland is an oft-told story. What made you want to study this region, and why did you think it held answers to your questions?
It's funny how I got into this particular region and area. I'm from New England and spent some time time growing up in Rhode Island in Narragansett Bay, so I just kind of knew the area. And what I was drawn to study was the fact that it kind of wasn't a region. Even though we know that New England and New Netherland were colonial areas, historians tended to just study New England through English sources or New Netherland through Dutch sources. And what I'm trying to do in the book, and what I hope to sort of get other people to follow the way, is to look at how New England and New Netherland are very much connected. And two events that I can tell you more about in more detail, the Pequot War and Keefe's War, I began by realizing how connected these two events were. And the more that I started looking at the entire century of English colonists and Dutch colonists invading this region, I started to see so many things were connected. And there was a general commonality, not only of Dutch and English colonists dealing with the same native people, but all of these events, all of the initial dealings being centered on the coast, the coastline, the water, and coastal resources. And that connection of the water, English and Dutch colonists dealing with native peoples, seemed to me to be a powerful one and worth exploring as my dissertation and then later the book.
You mentioned that the coast, the coastline, water, and coastal resources connected the area we now know as New England and southern New York. Yet, it also seems like native peoples connected the region too. Would you tell us about the Native Americans who lived along this New York-New England coastline?
The native population of this coastline is varied and diverse, and certainly to the native people living there circa 1600 before colonists had arrived, they would not see themselves in any way as being united culturally or politically, or even necessarily being that similar. But using sort of just kind of a big picture lens, there are some general commonalities to most people in the region. They all speak various dialects of Algonquian languages. People to the west speak a different subgroup of dialects that sort of fall under the family of Delaware or Lenape, and people to the east speak a group of dialects we call Southern New England Algonquian. And these groups, in terms of the sort of general common features, is they had similar houses that we know today as wigwams. They had a similar canoeing culture around large ocean-going dugouts and smaller birch bark canoes. They all had a somewhat similar economy and diet of raising corn over the summer, that being their main sort of cereal carbohydrate crop, and then their main sources of protein were fish, shellfish, and deer. So their economies and sort of paths of life, general seasonal calendars, all as near as we can tell from both historical sources and from the tribal memory of a lot of these people living today, bears a pretty strong resemblance. In terms of how many different groups lived in the region, it's fair to say there's at least 5 major dialects, and the total number of political entities, depending on how you count it, is over 20, probably really over 30. There's a little bit of a trouble looking back and trying to identify how many discrete political units are there, because of course colonists aren't really carefully trying to describe how villages sit under different chiefs or sachems or under different names. So the simple answer is over 20 Native American groups.
In Saltwater Frontier, Drew notes that we often forget that before Native Americans and Europeans met each other on land, they met each other at sea as fellow mariners. Drew, Kyle would like to know whether Native peoples developed the northeastern coastline and established ports like the Native Americans along the Pacific coastline did.
That's a wonderful question. The simple answer is yes, but obviously not like a European port. These are portages and points of departure for shallow vesseled canoes, both dugouts and bark canoes. So we certainly know that a lot of Native American villages were a point where you'd see a lot of canoes, and then later colonists sort of treating them like ports, where they would come to the same place, the same harbor, the same anchoring port. And so we know that the main village, for example, of the Narragansett on Narragansett Bay became so populous during the planting and harvesting seasons that one account, letter to John Winthrop Jr., refers to it as a great city, meaning that, there's thousands of people there. So we do see the sort of seasonal rise of ports. But one thing just to think about the Native American sort of geography and the way that they understand the coastline is by actually looking at Native American place names. So, there's a sort of easy white European stereotype about Native American place names kind of being at or near the whatever. Just relevant to this book, Jerry Seinfeld, who's from Massapequa, says, I'm from Massapequa, it means at or near the Great Mall. And the way that these names actually do work do have this geographic information encoded in them. So if you start translating native place names and looking at what they mean, you end up with a very detailed map of use and function of the shore, telling you which rivers are tidal, which aren't, which are brackish, which are salty, where you can find fish, where this is a good place to leave canoes. And that's what a lot of the Native American geography sort of translates as. And that, I think, helps us get a bit of a peek into the world as seen by the people living on this shore before colonists arrived.
This is fascinating, us considering Native Americans as mariners, because when most of us think of Native Americans, our mental images are of people who are adept at navigating inland territories and forests, or as hunters and horsemen on the Great Plains. So Would you tell us more about Algonquian mariners and their lives at sea?
So Native American maritime culture in this region is something that really interested me. And the main thing that I found out that really intrigued me, and I repeat several points in the book, is how large Native American canoes were. The larger dugouts were made out of mature, old-growth trees. And even by the most conservative reading of sources, we could say that the largest were close to 50 feet long and held over 40 people, possibly even more. And that these canoes had more people, went further, I think, than a lot of people might assume. We have various reports of canoes 50 miles away from where those native people made their homes, regular voyages of 20 or 30 miles over passages of semi-open ocean, and that Native American canoes also had sails. And Roger Williams, who's a colonist with many descriptions of native life, is very explicit in saying that these sails were something that native people were already doing before colonists got there. It wasn't like, oh, they never thought of a sail until seeing a colonial sailboat. So bringing that information, just the fact that there's a vibrant maritime culture, that these are big canoes capable of moving a lot of people around a far distance, really had me sort of think about where native space was in this region. Focusing on the material culture of seafaring made me think about all sorts of moments in a different way. So early trading appointments in between colonists and natives that often were on the water might involve a canoe that had 30 native people in it and a small shallop or yacht that might only have 4 or 5 colonists on it, sometimes as few as 2 or 3. And that sort of picture that I started to realize from reading the sources went entirely against the sort of normal picture of early contact, which has a towering European ship and a tiny little canoe. And sort of seeing the past, imagining this, really helped me understand it in a different way.
I want to talk about the meeting between Europeans and Native Americans. But before we discuss this meeting, what did Europeans think of Native American watercraft? Watercraft that had sails and could hold as many as 40 men.
The European sources, of course, are where I'm getting all this information, and I think it's fair to say they were generally quite impressed. They certainly saw this technology as inferior, but noting how adept native people were at getting around in canoes, how they could deal with many different depths of water, how they seemed to have an entirely different set of standards of what was safe weather to travel in versus Europeans, the fact that most Native Americans could swim very well and most Europeans could not, led to sort of repeated descriptions of native mariners as being adept, agile, possibly threatening, and having this, admittedly small craft kind of brown water naval presence, but being something that you had to be aware of on the water. And that really, just once I started to foreground maritime space, the more that all these accounts start sort of tell me of the water as a kind of negotiated space, where once Europeans came within sight of shore, they no longer really felt they had necessarily the full advantage.
It's interesting to hear how Europeans appreciated Native American watercraft. Of course, European accounts of contact between Europeans and Native Americans are often filled with wonder. Europeans often like to recount how Native Americans viewed European ships and the first Europeans as gods on floating islands. Given that Native Americans in northeastern North America were accomplished seafarers, Jason would like to know how Algonquian-speaking coastal dwellers really viewed Europeans and their ships upon their arrival.
Well, of course, really viewed is going to be a bit of an elusive answer for me and for anyone trying to understand how exactly people thought 400 years ago. But my understanding, and this is building on articles and some really good interventions by people like Paul Otto and Evan Haefele and other people who have looked at early contact narratives, is that these initial accounts that we have, which are usually related from a native person, probably someone who is a storyteller and someone in the role of collecting tribal history, and then written down by Europeans, that these stories had a lot more going on than what is assumed literally by the European listener. So a story that talks about sort of understandable and I think quite likely real awe, terror, mystification that was felt among native people when they saw ships is also being told by someone that now knows that Europeans and colonists are in vessels made of wood and are human beings. It's almost told as kind of, there's a degree of sort of irony or prophecy about how this would change the world going on in these stories. That just like any historical account that has nuances and being told later is from the perspective of someone looking back at what that moment signified to their people and the changes that came after it. So I think that when you read those accounts, it's always worth considering who's telling them and when. And it becomes usually a story about a kind of naivete that was lost, which does seem to be something genuine that native people went through in getting to know Europeans. And yes, genuinely being impressed and awed at vastly different and much more complex technology. But the whole idea of the kind of apotheosis, i.e. the arrival of a god, that does not seem to be, certainly after getting to know colonists, that's not how Native people tend to view them.
Drew, you've provided us with a good picture of what the New York-New England coastline looked like in the early to mid-17th century and of the Native Americans who lived along it. Before we dive deep into the interactions between Europeans and Native Americans, however, we should talk about the relations between the English and the Dutch, because the Europeans who settled along this coastline were imperial rivals. So, Drew, would you tell us about the Dutch-English rivalry and how it played out in North America?
This is something that has interested a lot of scholars on both Dutch and English Empire over the last decade or so, that these two overseas imperial efforts begin around the same time, that both the Kingdom of England and the Dutch Republic have an interest in challenging the primacy of Spain in the Atlantic and creating all these new links to new markets. The Dutch in particular are very focused on making inroads into the West Indies and the Caribbean basin, and the initial place of New Netherland within the Dutch Empire was a small, essentially refueling spot where an additional profit could be made trading with native people for furs and maybe collecting some fish as well. Seen as really part of fitting into a picture that's already kind of middleman empire of the Dutch being key in between and good sailors sort of linking up an expanding economy. For the New England colonies, they have several different origins and several different ways that English ships ended up in New England. The first wave mainly being fishermen, people interested in just logging, extractive, fishing, and timber-based colonies. And then, of course, by 1620, we have the arrival of religious refugees in the spot of Plymouth, and then later the Massachusetts Puritans coming in, and then sort of various spin-offs of their colonies moving on the coastline towards the Dutch. But those colonies were, of course, interested in turning a profit as well through fur trade, through fish, through some exporting of lumber, and those sort of different aims. In some ways, a more modest, just direct economic profit of the English colonies, and then the Dutch sort of wanting just a toehold and to consider whether really creating a larger settler economy is a question that the Dutch would kind of wrestle with over the century. There's always going to be fewer Dutch colonists than English colonists on the shoreline.
Okay, so let's explore interactions between these Europeans and Native American peoples along this coastline. How did the English and Dutch incorporate Native Americans into their imperial schemes, and what did Native Americans think about conducting trade and forming alliances with their new neighbors?
That's a great question, and it's funny because you could ask it the other way, too. How did Native Americans think about putting the Dutch and English in their economies? And maybe I'll just sort of start with that Native people, upon meeting colonists who wanted furs, rather rapidly started to produce more furs and trade further and trap more, seek out the furs that they knew would get a good return in Dutch and English goods. And Dutch and English traders were generally dealing in the same things. The typical trade goods are everything from very sharp-edged knives, hatchets, a whole lot of decorative material of beads, small mirrors, things that could be taken apart and repurposed into all sorts of jewelry, clothing decoration, beadwork. The material culture of the native people, and one thing that's common throughout this coast, was they tend to focus on all sorts of beadwork and headdresses and elaborate use of small decorative material that was incredibly valuable to the various craftsmen and craftswomen in these native villages. And then the other good that really helps connect these economies and allows Native Americans to incorporate Dutch and English traders into their world were these small sacred shell beads that the Europeans referred to as a wampum or zeelan, which Native people had for many centuries before the Dutch and English arrived. In early encounters between Dutch and English, in fact, moments of captivity where Native Americans were taken captive and then offered these beads as ransom, Dutch traders in particular seized on this idea that this could serve as a kind of currency or medium of trade. And it was especially useful to the Dutch, who also were trading further up the Hudson River, to have something that was valuable, portable, and could be traded among many different Native people. So accepting and collecting payments in wampum was a way that the Dutch could then show up far along the Hudson trade with Mohican and Mohawk peoples for their furs and give them something that was portable and not always a trade good. So these economies became connected by these shell beads that the native people of the shore started to produce in far greater numbers, and using European tools started to slightly transform these beads into something far more numerous and became only more central to their own decoration and various rituals that the beads were used useful in. So this shift is a really complicated one from the native point of view. From the Dutch and English point of view, they, of course, were selecting and learning about the consumer tastes of native people and slowly sort of realizing that certain goods could have more value than others. And they were often surprised to see that things that they brought to native people thinking it had one purpose would have a different purpose among native people. And the classic example of this is copper kettles and cookware that native people already had pretty good stoneware and clay. Instead of using these as kettles, the metal pots would be taken apart and turned into everything from arrow tips to jewelry and earrings and various other smaller cutting edges, rather than simply using the object as Europeans saw it useful. So it's a big, complex, and rich story of how trade reveals two cultures sort of overlapping and meeting and starting to mix together in unexpected ways.
It sounds like the trade between Native Americans and European colonists in this region was reciprocal. And what I mean by that is, it sounds like each party had their own desires and ends, and the trade between these groups really met those desires and ends.
Absolutely. It's a connected, multi-directional, kind of seemingly mutually beneficial trade between peoples. The simple point being that all three of these economies and cultures get very much connected first by trade.
We've talked a lot about trade, and now we should probably talk politics. Rhonda would like to know what coastal northeastern Native Americans thought about forming political alliances with the Dutch and English. Specifically, she'd like to know whether you found any cases in the historical record where Native peoples used the Dutch-English rivalry to their advantage.
So Native American people, in terms of forming alliances with the Dutch and English, I think the general point of view of Native people was to resist forming too close of alliance at first. We start to see that people on the eastern side of the shore, people closer to Cape Cod, experience some devastating epidemics early on. So Native people, including the Wampanoag and later Narragansetts, will end up forming strategic alliances with English neighbors that are similar to alliances formed in between Native peoples and have some sort of genuine depth to them and involve constant communication between leaders. On the Dutch side of the coast, because it was a little bit later before devastating epidemics started to destabilize that world, because the Dutch were so fewer in number, you see a much simpler sort of trading pact, a very low-level alliance that is not maintained through a lot of conversation. The sort of more aloof, arm's-length alliances are what we see in between the Dutch and the people, say, of the lower Hudson. In terms of how Native Americans came over time to realize that these two different groups of Europeans could be played off each other, there's many different moments that I found of Native people either trafficking in rumors about what the other colonists were up to, sometimes even deflecting moments of using the ambiguity about two different groups of colonists to try to explain Native actions. So there's this key moment early on in the events that lead up to the Pequot War, which begins in 1636, where Pequots were being held accountable for the murder of an English trader. And one of the initial explanations offered by a Pequot diplomat was that the people murdering him had an issue with the Dutch, and that they thought that this English sailor, John Stone, was Dutch and not English, and that's why they murdered him. And it was a way of sort of trying to explain how things had gone. So that's one moment of Native people being aware of this difference. It starts to get much more elaborate later into the century when the English and Dutch really are combining. Their own boundary is now a very close one on western Long Island Sound, that we start to see Native people showing up and reporting that they may have made alliances with the Dutch against the English. The most famous instance of this is when a Narragansett sachem known as Ninigret is accused of having secretly formed an alliance with Peter Stuyvesant in Manhattan in the early 1650s. And it's just as the English and Dutch are going to war in the larger Atlantic. And that rumor and trying to discover the truth becomes an obsession for the English and leads to a lot of paranoia and trading of threats in between the English and Dutch at that moment.
You know, now seems like a good time to discuss the Pequot War and Keefe's War. Would you tell us about these wars? How did these political and violent events shape the northeastern coastline and relations within the region?
The Pequot War is something I studied long before I started studying this region as an entire region. And I was shocked when I first started to learn more about Dutch colonialism in the area to learn how many people who had participated in the Pequot War, which is the mid to late 1630s, and then Keefe's War, which is the mid 1640s, were the same people. So the first war is predicated on the fact that the Pequots were alleged to be involved in the murders of a couple Englishmen. English colonists in the region form a large alliance with many other tribal peoples in the area who do not like the Pequots because the Pequots have been very successful in the early trade with both Dutch and English, and they create this sort of vast anti-Pequot alliance and engage in this really terrifying war, first targeting Pequot property, but then most famously attacking an entire Pequot village near what's now Mystic, Connecticut in 1637 and burning it to ground and killing probably around 400 people within an hour. And after that sort of terrifying massacre, the Pequots become refugees in their own homeland and sort of start to scatter throughout the region. And what happens several years later, after the Pequots have been brought to a truly culturally genocidal peace where they have to agree to give up their name, which thankfully they're able to reverse within a decade or so and can reclaim their name as being Pequot, the Dutch start to begin a war that at first looks like the Pequot War, where there's been some moments of tension and violence between traders and native people, and the Dutch governor, a man named William Keefe, attempts to kind of aggressively assert his control and intimidate people around him, and begins this war of his with a similar kind of massacre of surprising native people in the darkness and burning down villages. But it entirely backfires because, unlike the English, the Dutch do not go through the time to make an alliance before they start the war, and rather quickly an alliance forms against the Dutch, and we start to have waves of fighting back and forth over several years. And a few attempts at peace, the alliance slowly starts to break apart, and it leaves the Dutch in a position of, unlike the English, who managed to seize a huge amount of territory and what are uneven and subordinate alliances with native people to the east, to the west, the Dutch sort of end the war just kind of with a lot of misery and distrust. They haven't gained more land for themselves, and they have just kind of a simmering dislike, at least of the Dutch leadership among native people in the region, that in many ways I argue has a significant impact not only on native lives, but actually on the fate of the Dutch colony itself. That this sort of constant animosity with their native neighbors and then a series of small wars into the 1650s and 60s, it's a real weakening force on the Dutch colony. I think it hurts recruitment for getting colonists to come to the colony, and it saps a lot of energy and resources and time and attention away from the colonial leadership. So these two wars, this sort of connected decade of really horrific and terrifying violence, I think helps understand how so much of the rest of the century plays out between native people and their colonial neighbors.
Did the same Native American groups participate in both the Pequot War, which was largely in New England, and Keefe's War, which was largely in New Netherland?
No, and I should be pretty specific about this. The people who are combatants on the native side shift from being Pequots against the English, who have Mohegan, Narragansett, and a few other native allies. And Keefe's War is in between the Dutch and various tribal groups around Lower Manhattan that we refer to as Muncies, the Muncie dialect speakers, including the Wequageesek, the Canarsies, the Hackensacks, and several more that are fighting. There are a few native people, though, that play a role in both. So one particular figure that I focus on is a Narragansett sachem known as Miantonomi, who is a key ally of the English in the Pequot War. But after the Pequot War, when he realizes that how this has all been sort of a Trojan horse for an English conquest of the region, he turns on the English and starts to sharply criticize how they're dealing with Indians and believe that making a deal with colonists is almost certain to end badly. And he starts to preach that we need a larger native unity across the region. And he comes and starts to spread this message around the Muncies of the Lower Hudson, just as the tensions are rising before Keefe's attacks on them. And he ends up being this sort of conspiracy of his is discovered by one of his enemies, one of his native enemies, who that assassinates him on behalf of the English. But I argue that if you look at the response that the Muncies make, I think that that visit from Miantonomi has a real impact. And his sort of raising the specter of how native people need to unite against colonists helps explain why there's this coordinated and ready Muncie defense against the Dutch aggression that they face. So that's one particular native actor. Another point that I do make, though, is, of course, in the end of the Pequot War, so many Pequots end up in the region of the Lower Hudson as refugees and might have kinship links to those people. And it's almost certain that some of the native people who end up running from the English in the First War are also victims of Dutch aggression in the Second War. The fact that these native people have all sorts of links, marriage, kinship, familiarity through diplomacy with each other, means that there is some spillover of people from one area of the coastline to the next.
One of the interesting aspects of the Saltwater Frontier is how Drew discusses the Pequot War and Keefe's War as naval wars. Drew, would you tell us about the naval aspects of these wars?
I want to, of course, explain these two wars as political events. But the other thing that I discovered, particularly in looking at the origins of the Pequot War, and this is something that really pushed me towards taking Native American maritime force seriously, is the initial murders that become the casus belli of the English colonists leading that war happen on the water. There are attacks on boats by Native people. There's even a small skirmish and a chase at sea in between Native people who have hijacked and taken a small English vessel being chased by another colonial trader in what's Block Island Sound. And these moments of kind of naval engagement and then the early English attacks on the Pequots tended to show that when it came to colonists trying to attack Native people by coming from the water, they're at this inherent disadvantage because so many Native people are always on the water all day. There's constant lookout and surveillance and agility along this coastline. And that the attack at Mystic, I point out, there's this initial pass-by of the English forces to try to lull the Pequots into believing that they're going away. And then, in fact, they're camped out and waiting to attack the village. English colonists and soldiers overhear rumors of the Pequot celebrating that the English have run away and sailed away. And the reason that they're able to succeed in this attack is because they attack at night and from land, using native guides to bring them and show them a different way to this Pequot village that they attack. So they only really win once they move to land and en masse, of course, greater forces with more firearms than Native people have at the time that allows them to win. A similar pattern also begins with Keefe's War, with some of the early hostilities happening on the water, a fear of native mobility and the many different ways that Native people get around Manhattan with so many different waterways is what makes that war drag on. And that sort of amphibious nature of fighting is a key factor in understanding how Keefe's War is fought. And again, the element of surprise, nighttime attacks, village attacks are how the Dutch managed to prevail in that war.
Did King Philip's War, which took place between 1675 and 1678, also have a naval component to it? Because when we think about terrifying Native American colonist warfare within the Northeast region, King Philip's War comes to many of our minds.
King Philip's War is, in many ways, is connected to the Pequot War in that the English believe after the Pequot War that they have formed a fairly stable alliance with their native neighbors and that they've got it figured out. And if they have any fear of native people allying against them, it's that another more powerful inland native group like the Mohawks are going to ally with them and arm them and drive them against them. And as it turns out, the simple sort of long familiarity of living near to each other starts to wear on native people throughout this region. And it's the sort of moment by 1675, King Philip's War breaks out in this interesting political moment shortly after the Dutch have finally left this coastline. Just years before, rumors had circulated that this character, the Wampanoag sachem named Metacom, who is called King Philip, had supposedly been trying to ally with maybe the Dutch and maybe the French and any other imperial rival. Once the Dutch are gone, I think you see a pivot among the English in saying, well, now we can really have total control and we don't have to be quite so gentle when dealing with any sort of native behavior we don't like. It's the punishing of a few Wampanoag men for the killing of a Christian Indian that becomes the sort of main event that sparks ever-rising hostilities between the Wampanoags and mainly Plymouth colonists that, when it becomes a full-out war with armed attacks, leads to the Wampanoags forming a large anti-English alliance and the English allying together as colonies with some native allies against the Wampanoags. Back to the idea of where this war takes place, most of King Philip's War looks like what you'd assume a frontier war between native people and colonists would look like, of being inland, rivers, hills, the wooded setting that we might think of. And I argue that the reason we don't see particularly a huge amount of naval engagement is because very early on in the war, English colonists make a deliberate decision to try to cut off any and all maritime mobility that the native people have. So early on, there's coastal patrols, there's a seizing, burning, and scuttling of hundreds of canoes all throughout Narragansett Bay and the heart of the Wampanoag homelands. And this is a deliberate attempt to prevent them from summoning allies from outlying islands, from Long Island or Block Island or Cape Cod. And this patrol actually continues all the way to Manhattan, where Edmund Andros personally comes and patrols Long Island Sound in his own small boat to survey any canoes crossing the Sound and issues an order that all native people on Long Island need to surrender their canoes to the colonial governor in Manhattan, and that any native person found in possession of a canoe during the war will be immediately punished. So this attempt to kind of close the saltwater frontier is a direct and I think strategically successful attempt by the English to sort of keep native people grounded. And during the war itself, the fighting does end up kind of moving back to Narragansett Bay, this vast island-strewn estuary in the heart of Wampanoag and Narragansett country. And there are some key battles at the end and moments of diplomacy that take place on canoes with English colonists hitching rides with native allies and native people who are allowed to have canoes serving as some of the most useful spies. And King Phillip is famously killed in a brackish tidal marsh and ends up face down in the mud. And then some of his key allies actually die during the war because they don't have canoes and they have to quickly fashion rafts that are unstable and lead to drowning. So there's this kind of interesting maritime dimension to the war, even if the majority of the battles and the engagement happens on an inland theater. There's this coastal dimension that helps explain how the fighting starts and how the English have this new appreciation for the mobility and flexibility of native people on the water that informs how they start the war.
We've just had a whirlwind tour of 43 years worth of European, Euro-American, and Native American warfare. So it may be surprising to us that peace actually came at the end of King Philip's War. Well, at least for a time. And during this peace, it seems like Native Americans and colonists were working together along the northeastern coastline and building a profitable business in whaling. Drew, would you tell us about the fledgling American whaling industry and its development?
This is a transition of, using this term, the Saltwater Frontier, that takes place really a little bit before King Philip's War on eastern Long Island and then spreads throughout the region after King Philip's War, in which English colonists who had long looked at whales and seen a source of profit start working with Native American whalers as their main labor of creating a shore fishery, where they use native people in small whaleboats to hunt nearby right whales and then tow them to shore and melt down their blubber. And in the moments before they started working with native people, numerous English colonists and Dutch colonists had attempted to start a whale fishery. And what they found is it's very hard. You need a lot of particular skills and equipment that they didn't necessarily have or didn't know how to work properly. And you also need a set of skills that not every English mariner has, of being able to handle small boats very adeptly, arm strength, being able to get back into a boat if it's overturned, even just a sense of where these whales show up and when. That's all cultural information that native people have. Now, there are native traditions of whaling throughout North America. There doesn't seem to be any strong evidence that native people were active whalers before colonists arrived, as in they would go to sea to hunt whales. They certainly did what we call shore drift fishing, where whales washed ashore. They would make all sorts of use of the whale carcass. And in fact, the whales were so abundant in these waters, whales could be a part of their diet and their culture and their economy simply because there were so many that drift whales could be counted upon. And what happens with the beginning of the fishery itself is native people have this general sense of the fishery and a lot of direct skills, and what the English have are equipment. They have small whaleboats and they have harpoons and ropes that are well suited to this purpose. So beginning on eastern Long Island in the late 1660s, early 1670s, this practice of using native people as whaling hands and whalemen spreads to Nantucket and Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and elsewhere along the coast. The way that the English managed to recruit and then retain Native American labor is very exploitive. They end up signing and creating these sort of contracts and legal systems of debt that commit native whalers to working for the same whaling interests year after year. So charging them for the loss of any equipment, selling them and reimbursing them in company goods, which were often very similar to the trading items that traders were selling to native people years before for wampum. They're now sort of trading in whale oil instead of wampum. But colonists are very much encouraged natives to accrue debt, and then they use that debt to say, well, then you'll come back and work for me for the next season. And this kind of debt peonage is what really sustains this whole whaling economy, which has this big flourishing into the early 18th century and ends when essentially the native hunters are too successful and manage to all but drive the right whale to extinction along the shore and overfish all the local stocks of migratory whales, which in turn leads to colonists having to reinvent the whole business of whaling. And it's Nantucket whalers who invent a whale blubber tryworks, which is a kettle that renders oil into a stable and exportable commodity. They figure out how to put tryworks, these kettles, aboard ships without lighting the whole ship on fire. And this invention of the tryworks in the 1650s is a direct response to this overfishing that was funded by all the colonial whalers with native labor. And it's the birth of an actual at-sea whale fishery, which had never been done before Nantucket whalers invented it. And when they start to go out further to the sea, seeking out further away right whales and other even more profitable species species like sperm whales, they again leave with majority native crews. And native people continue to be economically and culturally entwined with these Yankee whalers and larger commercial interests and become key population in New England's maritime community as ordinary seamen, as whalers, as harpooneers, and also become involved in shoreside industry as well. So the Native American and colonial maritime economies have a dynamic relationship that's creative, it's exploitative, it often has unexpected consequences, and it persists for centuries after this initial engagement at sea. And that's really sort of end point of this, is that as Western historians don't want to see the idea of, say, a frontier or cultural engagement ending, say, after 1890, I don't think we should see this saltwater frontier as simply closing with the definitive English triumph in King Philip's War. My argument is if we keep looking at the water, this cultural area of interplay and suspicion and cooperation continues for a long time.
Before we move into the time warp, I'd like for us to explore one more idea. At the end of Saltwater Frontier, Drew contends that the Algonquian world became bigger after the colonial period. Drew, it seems like native worlds grew smaller after the colonial period, when you consider the dispossession of Native Americans from their lands between the 17th and 19th centuries. Lynn would like to know how many Native American peoples along the coastal region were dispossessed, and we'd all like to know how the worlds of these coastal groups grew bigger as time went on.
The answer to Lynn's question is a very simple one. Every single native person loses close to or all of their land and possessions in the colonial invasion. That the initial sort of set-asides of reservations offered to native people in terms of peace and in negotiation always shrank over time. And by the late 19th century, a lot of state governments in the region were very aggressively trying to shatter and detribalize all of the existing native governments along the shore. And the fact, of course, that many of these governments and peoples and tribal bodies stayed together and have survived to this day is a pretty incredible story. To understand that, I think you have to understand how much the Native American peoples living along this region were not simply just clustered into reservation life and limited by the very small land that they had remaining of their homelands, that they were able to survive, to learn more about the colonial culture around them, to change and have this dynamic history by dealing in the larger maritime world, with men becoming mainly sailors in the whale fishery, with women as well becoming parts of port communities, inviting new people into their tribal communities who weren't native. Everything from European sailors to free and enslaved African Americans and various biracial people become part of these native communities. These native communities also increasingly adopt Christianity, which they are learning through their engagement with colonial neighbors, and the Christianity that they themselves start to spread among themselves. And the various native denominations that form in this region are all about taking this engagement with a larger world, but to reassert who they are and where they come from and their deeper Native American past to a sense of who they are in the future. So I see that these reservations and these people from the 18th century to today are filled with people who have seen much of the world, in many cases much more of the world than their neighbors, people who have met and dealt with a grand variety of people and are engaging with ideas that are indeed quite foreign and different and repurposing them and changing the world. So the idea isn't, of course, to say that Native American people prosper in this thing, that there is a loss of language, a loss of cultural tradition, and a loss of many profound and irreplaceable things. That, of course, that is part of the story, that shrinking is indeed part of the story. But I also argue there's another kind of expansion, dynamism, term I throw out once in the book is cultural buoyancy that we see for the people along this region that I think is quite profound. Without overplaying it or turning this too happy of a story is worth remembering and understanding the strength and flexibility of these cultures, these political bodies. It's a fascinating thing. While I don't really tell this whole story because my book had to end somewhere, I hope that I've offered one explanation or dynamic to this story that I think has interested a lot of historians of the region. If anyone reads my book and wants to know more, I would highly, highly recommend they pick up two books by Nancy Shoemaker, who's an historian who's looked at Native people as whalers, mainly in the 18th and 19th century. She's written a book, Native American Whalemen and the World, and another book called Living with Whales, that are valuable explorations of how for New England Native people, the sea itself, whales in particular, are an entry to a whole nother and a whole larger world and planet. And that is, I think, a fascinating story. And I hope to see more work on this aspect of Native American history.
It's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if contact between Native Americans and Europeans had somehow taken place on land instead of on the sea? How would the lack of an ocean meeting have affected how Europeans and Native Americans met each other and conducted their relations after their meeting?
That's a really fun and interesting question. I will just say one small point, and then I'll try to answer it. The fascinating thing to me, I think, is the more that I've done this work and then read historical works about other regions, is that the fact of the on-sea meeting and maritime engagement seems actually the norm throughout anywhere that people met on the planet. That meeting at the edge of the sea is just a place where cultures meet. It's common throughout the Pacific and Pacific Islands and Oceania. It's common throughout the American coast. It's common in Australia. It's common anywhere, and that European expansion has this real coastal character to it from the perspective of various people around the world who deal with Europeans. So I just want to say that it's just part of just human culture, no matter who we're talking about. If people live by the water, they use the water and they move on it, and they have a mobility and a claim to it, and that fact seems like an important part of telling the history of global colonialism. So that is something that I sort of think I've come to, and then looking at some other books coming out recently, I realized a lot of other scholars have started to zero in on this idea. So I just want to say that. Now, if we imagine Native American people as being these bizarre people who live by the ocean but do not have any mobility on it, do not use it, do not have technology or tradition around it, and that Europeans arrived in this region and this water wasn't already a human space, I think the European advance would be a lot slower. I think that the ability of Europeans to move around this shore, essentially sailing blind, was vastly aided by all the native people they used as guides and all the information and mapping of the shore they got from native informants. I think that their ability to take advantage of these fisheries would be severely restricted without native assistance. If you look at just the initial survival of colonies, certainly being able to trade with and buy fish from native people was a key part of just keeping their communities fed, especially in early years. So I would think that Europeans would have a significant amount of trouble being able to exploit this region's resources had there not been an ancient civilization already there that is well aware of all the riches that exist in this coastline. I also think that warfare itself would have looked quite different, and that these initial sort of fire spots of conflict wouldn't have flared up the same way they did. There is sadly some inevitability, of course, of conflict. Europeans looking to always expand their realm and control over the region. That sort of general impulse is going to lead to conflict. But just sort of playing this scenario forward, if we imagine as just very terrestrial Native American culture meeting Europeans, that it's entirely likely, if there weren't native people who knew the water in this region when Europeans came here, that a significant amount of the New England maritime economy might have been much slower to develop and may have developed in a different way. That indeed, what many things we think of as quintessential New England cultural features, mainly the whale fishery and this kind of global engagement that the whale fishery necessarily creates, may not have happened without Native American labor. This might not have been the part of the world where the try-works and deep sea whaling was created. And without that exploitable, low-paid labor force provided by Europeans, it wouldn't have gone the same way. And when you take whaling out of the American story, you change everything. The amount of whaling families involved in the creation of an American empire after the Revolution, involved in the expansion of American realtors, is pretty profound. One thing I always like to point out is the Luce and Macy families are both families that began by employing Native American whalers and getting involved in the Macy's family. And without them, we wouldn't have R.H. Macy Company, we wouldn't have the Time Life media network. If we take those two families and their fortunes out of the American story, it feeds into a larger sort of narrative of American capitalism. If you take away all this native agency and culture and activity out of the 17th century, a lot of things will go different afterwards.
What's next for you, Drew? Are you investigating other aspects of Native American maritime culture, or are you working on a different type of project?
I'm looking at a specific person, someone who shows up in my book and is well known to kindergartners on, the Wampanoag man known as Squantum or Squanto. And I'm writing what will probably be a shorter book about what happened to Squanto before the Mayflower arrived and after. So I'm calling it Squanto, A Native Odyssey. And it's about how this man who was taken captive in 1614 ends up in Malaga, Spain, and then London, and then Newfoundland, and then back to his home village of Patuxet shortly before it's turned into the colony of Plymouth, to sort of reimagine the world that created the Plymouth colony, the world that this man lived in, and that encounter in between Wampanoag and English colonists from sort of a new light. We're coming up on the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower landing, and I'd like to tell a story about that moment that doesn't feel quite as familiar, that talks about a larger Atlantic world, that talks about the enslavement of Native people. I'll never fully recreate the Native perspective, but has us think about this from a very human scale of one person who's taken away from home, has to find a long way back there, and when he arrives, finds that his home has been changed. It seems like such an elemental and interesting story to me, and the challenge of trying to tell it through both finding new sources, reading some familiar sources in a different way, to me seems like a lot of fun, and it's a project I'm really getting excited about and very active in trying to seek out sources and also sources of funding. So hopefully that will be completed within a few years.
Where is the best place to look for more information about you and how we can get in contact with you if we still have questions about Native American maritime culture within the Northeast?
I would welcome that. I am on Twitter. My handle is AC_Lipman, Lipman. And you can also find me by email at anlipman@barnard.edu or through the Barnard website. And of course, I would love to hear from anyone interested in these topics, wanting to know more, or with interesting ideas to share or recommendations for me. I would really appreciate that.
Andrew Lipman, thank you for expanding our notions of the early American maritime world by giving us a tour of the Saltwater Frontier.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. I really enjoyed this.
It's fascinating to consider northeastern Native American peoples as mariners. Unless we live along or grew up on the North American West Coast, in the northern reaches of Canada, or in the Caribbean, few of us think about Native Americans as seafaring peoples. And yet, as Drew demonstrated, Native Americans along the northeastern coast were mariners, and they had a rich and vibrant maritime life. Evidence of northeastern Native American knowledge and life upon the seas has long been staring at us from historical sources. For example, 17th century New England colonist Roger Williams wrote about how Native Americans had boats with sails and how they'd been using them long before Europeans arrived. In fact, it was Native American knowledge of the seas and how to live upon them that gave rise to the important and profitable early American whaling business, which, when you think about it, is a surprising development given that it emerged from cooperation between Native Americans and colonists, people who spent nearly 45 years of the 17th century at war with each other. You can find more information about Drew, his book, The Saltwater Frontier, plus the names and titles of the historians and books Drew mentioned on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/104. Don't forget to tell someone about Ben Franklin's World and why you enjoy it. By telling someone else about the podcast, you'll not only help the show grow, you'll help me and our guest historians share our passion for early American history with others. What do you think about the idea that the northeastern coastline between Manhattan and Cape Cod represented one cohesive region during the 17th century? Send your thoughts to liz@benfranklinsworld.com, tweet me @LizCovart, or post a comment on the show notes page or in our listener community on Facebook.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.